Welcome to Data Driven Leaders, a podcast for business and technology leaders who are trying to shape and influence the future of data and analytics. In each episode, we feature conversations with data-driven leaders who are at the forefront of using data to solve complex business challenges. Let's jump in now and uncover some of the biggest challenges today's data-driven leaders face and find out what it really takes to build a data-driven culture.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Data Driven Leaders. I'm your host, Christina O'Reilly, and this episode is brought to you by Gen Squared, a service provider dedicated to solving complex data and analytics challenge for today's enterprise. So I think it's safe to say that data has become one of the most valuable assets in enterprise, right up there with people, right? And when used effectively, when data is used effectively, it has the capacity to really have a transformative impact on businesses. And as we've discussed in previous podcasts, transforming that data into insights is challenging, and often its true value is difficult to realize. You see, data alone does not automatically generate value. There needs to be a process. There needs something to be driving it, supporting it, moving it forward, so that businesses can really move beyond just managing their data to really focusing on the strategic use of the data they manage. So how can businesses use their data to not only improve the outcomes, but also create new ones without getting lost in the sea of information along the way? My guest today is Derek Manuge, the CTO and co-founder of Railz, who believes that a successful data management strategy really is based on 4 key elements. Welcome, Derek. It's really great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get right into it, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit of Railz and what you're hoping to achieve.
Yeah, of course. So Railz is what we describe as an accounting data as a service company. We provide a single API that connects to every major accounting software platform to provide our end users with quick access to normalized financial data that they can use for decision making or analytics or pretty much anything their mind can conjure up. So we've been in operation now for about 2 years, but the software itself has been in development for many years prior to that. And that was how this journey came to be for me. Essentially, my career has been spent in risk management and finance and on the tangent of accounting, whereby really what we need is the cleanest data and the most robust data as possible in order to make decisions, financial or otherwise. And the challenge that I found throughout my career as someone that manipulated data, wrangled it, used it to build models was that it was hard to come by, it wasn't clean, and about 40 to upwards of 80% of my time was spent focused on just that, is producing it into a format that we could actually use. And so that's what kicked off this journey to where we are today.
Wow. Talk about a sea of information when it comes to dealing with financial data. And so in speaking of that, data, we know that it's really there to help improve businesses on many fronts, right? And you've seen it yourself, I'm sure, right? By whether it's providing a better understanding of their customers or help identify, eliminate some of the efficiencies or add new efficiencies, right? And supposedly it's there to help make faster, smarter decisions, business decisions. Or is it really? Let's talk about that for a second. How strategic are we using the way in which how we use data today?
It's still very much, in my opinion, at the cusp of becoming more ubiquitous. Data is a strategy that a lot of larger organizations are starting to focus on. And in certain sectors of the economy, it's becoming mandated in a regulatory fashion, whether it's banking data or even some of the open finance and open banking policies that are being put forth around the world. And this relates to security and privacy primarily, but not necessarily over the usage of that data and how you can really extract valuable insights from that. So data, obviously, we're getting more and more of it each year, more than we can actually use, more than what's actually relevant. So it's really up to the end user, and in many cases, us to help contextualize that information so that people can build insights and analytics on top of it.
Yeah, right. So, a lot of businesses today are really, struggling with the volume of data that they have and how do they use it and where do they go. So, what are some of the common mistakes that you've seen that businesses are doing where they're failing to be able to not only tap into their data, but actually generate value from it?
Well, I think it starts with the old adage that garbage in is garbage out.
Right.
And I do think that a lot of institutions are not placing enough emphasis on the quality of data, specifically if they plan on using it in some type of financial operational or even a significant material way within
Hmm.
their companies. Now, when we talk about what data quality is, everyone tends to have a different perspective on what that means. And rightfully so, because it depends on how you plan on using that data. Now, the way that at least I view data quality can be broken down into a number of different characteristics. For us, because we play in the financial and accounting data space, obviously there's the characteristic of completeness, which is crucial, where you want
Hmm.
to make sure that if you're looking at financial data on an individual business, you actually have the complete financial set of information available to you. If you're missing half of a balance sheet or 100 transactions, well, that's no good, and you're going to end up making poor decisions as a result of that. So
Right,
there's some
right.
ways that we've actually internally helped manage against that in order to ensure completeness. For example, if you're looking at 1,000 transactions for a business and you happen to know that the sum of those transactions once posted against the chart of account does not equal what the chart of account value
Yeah.
is from the different data set, then you obviously know that there's some type of issue there.
Hmm.
And that's one thing that I think we look at versus a lot of other ETL or data providers in the market is how can we use augmented data in order to ensure that there is true completeness from a contextual standpoint, not
Hmm.
just with the source object. So we can take a full data set from a source system, bring it all the way into our database, and they could match one to one. But if we know based on third party or augmented information that you're missing some context to that, then that provides an additional layer of completeness, almost like a completeness squared check
Hmm.
that we do. And then, of course,
Hmm.
that's just one characteristic. If you want to expand upon data quality, you can look at things like accuracy or validity of that data source, representativeness of that data, and of course,
Yeah.
the timeliness of it as well. Data is only as good as when you first have it, and if it's live, you want to make sure that you update that in as real time as possible because it's always evolving and ever changing. So these are some of the things you want to combat against if you're thinking about truly designing a proper data management strategy where you want to optimize decision making on top of it.
And a lot of what you're saying is not just relatable to, like, say, the financial sector, right? That a lot of what you just said, the completeness of the data and the quality of the data really expands across all areas of the business and all sectors or all verticals, right? One of them being, I was talking to someone who's in retail who's struggling with the complete data on the retail side of the customer or the consumer. And so that exists as well. And a lot of the two components, what you just said, the data quality and why are we doing this in the first place, is definitely a theme that I've heard more and more as we've been chatting with a lot of people on our podcast. And it sounds like, would you think that it's a modern problem today that we're dealing with as it relates to data that requires a modern approach, modern tools, and that we're still applying, I guess you could say, old school thinking and old school approaches to how we're wrangling data?
Yes, in many ways. I mean, you can almost think of it like a 1.0, a 2.0,
Hmm.
and a 3.0 of where we want to get to. And I think we're kind of in that 2.0 stage right now where we're basically creating data and we're moving it on different rails, if you will, from
Hmm.
point A to point B. But
No
we're
pun
not doing,
intended.
yeah, but we're not doing anything with that data specifically in order to ensure the integrity of it. I think in the next evolution of this, which is more the 3.0 side, what we'll start doing is using third party augmented data sets to truly almost put a reliability or fidelity score against the quality and integrity of that information so that essentially how reliable is it to make decisions on top of. I don't think we're there yet. And if you look at the
Hmm.
space where there's a number of data aggregators or ETL providers out there, many of them are focused on just aggregating the data. And that's, in its own right, a noble feat. But if you're not making sense of it, if it's not consistent, if it's not timely, it's not valid, it's not accurate, it's not complete, and the context of that data has not been verified from a third party, then it's hard to rely on. And I think that's where we need to move the industry towards.
In your conversations with your customers and just in general, when you're talking to people in the industry, do you find that a lot of them are underestimating the challenges that the volume of data is bringing them and just the steps required to get to, let alone 3.0, maybe there's a 2.0 in there that they need to do, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the reason why Rails exists in the first place is we're almost like your outsourced data science team or data analytics team in the sense of let us take care of that data aggregation and the cleaning and the normalization and the analytics so that you can focus on your core product and you can build whatever service or software that you want to supply to your end customer. So you don't have to worry
Hmm.
about the tooling and the infrastructure that's all underneath the hood. You can think of us as effectively that data infrastructure layer, whereby our customers are building those next generation financial service products or other types of products on top. So it's in many ways, I think, a reason why we exist in the first place. And it's so that you don't have to spend, like I was doing in my early days, 40 to 80% of my time actually cleaning and playing with the data.
Wow. That's a lot of time spending on just the data itself, let alone trying to be strategic. And I guess that begs the question. I think most people are probably still at that point where they're focused on cleaning and not necessarily looking at, how to the strategic use of the data itself. So at the beginning, I mentioned that, you believe that the keys to generating value with data lie in a, successful data management strategy. So let's break that down. Like, what are some of the components, in your opinion, that are required to have a successful data management strategy?
Yeah, I mean, we can get into a lot of the details at a granular level. I think on the surface of it, it's knowing how you want to use the data and then designing your data management strategy around that. So
Hmm.
if you know you only need a small subset of information and it should be available and timely within, a 24-hour period, then that's great and you can build a data management architecture that suits that specific purpose. If you know you need a subset of your data that has to be live at all times and verifiable and accessible, then build a data management strategy around that. I think a lot of this is about thinking about your end use of the data and your customers that, or potentially even internal stakeholders that are going to be using it, and then
Hmm.
designing the specific frameworks and architecture that suit those objectives. I think a lot of, especially newer companies that don't have necessarily the experience with building very large legacy data lakes or data management strategies, tend to focus on here's one solution, here's one database, here's one data access layer to
Hmm.
access it, rather than thinking about those more granular components. And on top of that, obviously, as you start to have more flexibility to your architecture and management practices, you end up in a state where there's obviously added fragility, there's added security risks, there's added areas for latency, network or otherwise. And so being long term in your approach to your design of it, I think is going to save you hours and potentially lots of dollars as well throughout that process.
I think you just nailed it too. It's long term, right? It's not something that can happen overnight. It takes planning, it takes patience. And it also probably, do you feel that there's a level of education internally about the data and how to interpret it and what the people are seeing in terms of the information in front of them? It's not just about giving them access anymore. It's also making sure that they understand the information that they're reading.
Yeah, and interpretability is a huge component of it. I don't think we can expect that every stakeholder in an organization will know how to interpret some of the data, will understand the statistics behind it, or understand how they can effectively use it in their day to day.
Hmm.
There's a hand holding component to this where you almost have to enable them through business intelligence tools, reports, or other easily digestible ways of using the data to drive their outcomes. And so
Hmm.
that's a component of many organizations that I still think is nascent. And you're starting to see more data and analytics functions start to crop up.
Hmm.
But it's still very much on an ad hoc basis rather than the foundational processes that have been put in place to actually run an organization end to end using these automated reports and analytics and such.
Hmm.
So I do think that there's definitely more opportunity there to enhance that. From an operational standpoint, I would also mention that a lot of the tools and insights and analytics that are out there that organizations can effectively run on can be readily available as long as your organization is willing to extract them. In many cases, the data is already there, it's just not being shown to the end
Hmm.
user. I think making it available is one of the first steps in that journey towards actually utilizing your data to the fullest.
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations underestimate the importance of visualizing the data, and in turn, that creates a great storytelling moment so that they can then use the data. So it is like a circle, so to speak, in terms of that. You
Mhm.
mentioned, and you've been in the financial industry for most of your career, and primarily around security risks, so to speak, risk management. So, I have to ask you, what are some of the lessons you've learned throughout your career that you carry forward with you around data as it relates to security and risks and compliance that you even in part share with your customers?
Yeah, so I do think obviously security is extremely important,
Right.
especially now in today's age. We've seen like cyber risk attacks increase by like fivefold in the last few years. And if in some cases it's damaging insurance companies that provide that type of coverage because they couldn't even foresee the risk that would increase during the last few years. And so I think there's certain strategies that you can implement to secure against outside attacks or even potentially internal errors. And having a proper security management framework internally is crucial for that, especially if you're dealing with financial data or other highly sensitive information. I do think there's a bit of a wild, wild west right now still in the industry where you see a lot of data aggregators and ETL providers that are a bit fast and loose with security. And this is partly in the startup, early stage growth tech company space. But
Hmm.
that's ever changing. There's a lot more, we'll call them cybersecurity as a service platforms that are starting to pop up that you can embed inside your organizations to more efficiently infiltrate the security information necessary into your employees. And I do think that's a good step towards having more security risk management
Hmm.
being ubiquitous amongst smaller companies, but we're still very far away from the level that's needed. The good thing,
Well,
these other types of third party certifications are effectively the standards that many companies should be working towards. And so if you do see that badge essentially on the website of one of your service providers, it can give you some ease around
mhm.
exactly knowing that there is some comfort and there's been a third party audit against the security protocols of that company. The last
Mhm.
thing I'll leave you with here is that there is actually like a competitor in the space, and I won't name the names, where I was on a call with them about a year and a half ago, and they shared their screen, and there was a Google sheet with all of their database credentials, their account credentials, and their server credentials.
Oh
And
my goodness.
I could have just clicked print screen. And that goes to show you how still archaic and legacy, or at least maybe people underestimate the risks that are truly out there, and how
Right.
one little error like that could absolutely decimate a company.
I was just going to ask you, what are some of the things that you're seeing that are the practices that I'm sure you just keeps you up at night? And I think that one would definitely be keeping you up at night. So, what are some of the new tools that you were mentioning? You were mentioning this new security and compliance as a service. And what are some of the other new things that are coming out in terms of safety or security as it relates to compliance and risk that you've noticed?
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to, for example, like almost automated like attack systems
Mm.
where they try and infiltrate your systems. There's a lot of it comes down to, for example, like testing workflows. So if you created code, let's say on the front end, and there's some element of authentication or credentials that you have to input on the front end, it will try and essentially hack its way, brute force or otherwise, through your front end. And all of that's automated, whereas, in the past, maybe it hasn't been. This kind of goes down the line of as well penetration testing and having third parties provide either software and or manual efforts to try and get into your systems. There's, on the cybersecurity as a service front, from a management standpoint, there are platforms like Vanta and Tugboat Logic, which is what we use
Yep.
in order to manage a lot of the risks and compliance that's ongoing. And that's really more for, ensuring that the proper permissions are being applied across the org. Every employee has the proper training that's necessary in order to understand the risks that are inherent by working in a remote company, as long as some of the other audit requirements and controls that need to be put in place to ensure that you're compliant in an ongoing manner to whether it's SOC 2 or these other standards. So there is a ton of tools out there that are currently available, and they're only getting better each year.
Do you find a lot of companies are taking this serious now? Like, are they really coming around and realizing that this is a serious threat and this is a high risk if within their organization?
Yes and no. I think a lot of people forget that there are these large scale hacks that have happened in the past. Whether
Yes.
Microsoft or Equifax or there's countless number of them where private information has been leaked. And if you want to go into the dark web, I'm sure you can find some credit cards on personal identifiable information as well. So there is avenues where people are still actively attempting, and in fact at a higher frequency now than before, trying to grab that information and use it, either for nefarious ways or otherwise. But I do think that at least the temperature maybe has increased slightly in the last couple of years as the world moved more remote, as we recognize that cyber risks are potential real threats. And how can we as organizations and people essentially thwart those potential attacks and
Mm-hmm.
risks in the future? And so, yeah, the temperature's changing a bit. There's still a lot more work that can be done there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when you start to realize that there's a reputational risk and a financial risk and an operational risk that could absolutely devastate a company, you start to take that more seriously. However, it starts at the top, and you need a champion within your own org in order to set a healthy dialogue around what cyber risk is. And I still think few institutions have that internal champion. So, I mean, if I were to recommend anything, is to hire someone who their entire focus is ensuring that you have a high security culture, even amongst employees that don't necessarily touch the databases or the
Mm-hmm.
credentials of your users, but because those are not the ones that are most susceptible to phishing attacks and other types of attacks, it's the employees that maybe are not as IT minded.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. You were just, when you were talking about, operational risk and financial risk, I read a really crazy stat by Gartner, a study that they did, and they said something about, organizations believe poor data quality to be responsible for an average of $15 million per year in losses, right? But what's interesting is, like, I wonder how many organizations are able to quantify how much loss, like data loss, is impacting their business. Can you speak to that? Like, have you been able to work with organizations to give them a sense of, quantify some of their data loss as a result?
Yeah. In fact, before I started Railz, I was a financial risk management consultant, and I had a number of clients, one of which was, a large pension fund. And I had developed a model for them that helped estimate the potential cyber loss that would have resulted in their portfolio companies if there were a breach to occur, like one of those large scale attacks against Equifax or Microsoft. And so I did have a model and a framework that could actually quantify a dollar figure based on a number of operational and financial metrics of a business. However, it's an estimate. And
Yeah.
I think the reality is some data breaches tend to get picked up by the media and tend to have more wide scale impacts than others. And in many cases, you don't know probably the majority of the data breaches that do exist because they're contained and they don't make it to the newspapers. And so
Interesting.
I do think that on a global scale, it's even hard to put a number about around what the average yearly losses might be for an organization. So, I mean, that's one of the scary things. It's like you don't know the certainty behind this, and it's an unknown, really, in many cases.
Exactly. And it's also the financial loss is not just around data breaches too. It's also around low quality of data. To your point when you said earlier, garbage in, garbage out, that alone must have a significant financial impact when you're just continuously bringing in bad data.
Yeah, and if you look at just the lending industry in general, you see companies that will rely on user-generated input for financial information or direct integrations into accounting systems, which is the service that Railz provides. And you can quantify between the two how lower the credit risk will be based on using granular information from the single source of truth on a business, their accounting system, versus having just user-generated inputs. And that's not just credit risk, but then you also save on the fraud risk side. If you can tamper with the information that you're supplying to a lender and you ask for a loan, there's a high propensity or a higher propensity that you may modify or exaggerate some of those numbers that you're sharing. And so the operational risks, the credit risks, the fraud risks, it all reduces as long as you have access to that data and you're using it in a proper way.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface with you as it relates to, data risk and data quality, but we're almost out of time. But before we go, I was wondering if you could perhaps share with us some of your top 3 things that you would encourage businesses to start thinking about when it comes to data management practices.
Yeah, of course. So 1, security. I think we've covered that a lot today. I think it's important that institutions think about managing those risks that may or may not exist today. 2, think about the long-term design and architecture of how you want to manage your data. And this goes into how it's going to be used by the end product or the end user. Does that data have to be available at all times? Does it have to be timely? What's the format of that data would be best ingested by the end user? And then finally, think about the users in the context of how's the best way to showcase it to them. Because not everyone is a data-minded individual, and sometimes graphs and visualizations are the best way for people to digest that information. So 1, security, 2, long-term thinking about design, and then 3, how to present the information in a way that's interpretable, digestible, and at the end of the day, fun, because data is fun.
Yes, I completely agree with you on that one. Great insight and great advice. Listen, thank you for joining us today, and I hope you can come back again soon.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Christina.
Thank you for checking out this episode of Data Driven Leaders. This show is brought to you by Gen Squared, an organization dedicated to solving data and analytics challenges for the modern enterprise. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow Data Driven Leaders wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or visit gensquare.com to get immediate access to all of the latest episodes.